In a straight-on, basic 1v1 ZvZ, having balanced party compositions isn't as important as it is having a balance across the entire zerg, but it can be handy in a couple of ways. Um, One is that as the zerg gets larger, you'll eventually start splitting into multiple groups, fighting on multiple fronts, or possibly even multiple objectives if you're like taking multiple castles. The shot caller may even micromanage individual parties within a fight, and so you're going to want each party to be balanced. Secondly, they can give your shot caller a basic overview of the Zerg. They can open their map, check where their dots are, as well as the health bars of their tanks, healers, and DPS within their party, and get kind of an idea of how things are going. Lastly, it can give your healers a sense of it can also give your healers a sense of how things are going. Um, some healers use the party frames directly to target and heal people, but even for those that don't, it can give you a quick suggestion as to where heals are needed, i.e. the tanks are all taking damage or a bunch of cloth DPS are taking damage, things like that. The standard MMO party composition is the 5-man party of tank, healer, and 3 DPS. In Albion, we have a total party limit of 20, so our most basic group composition is to just take this 5-man party and times it by 4. This leaves us with 4 tanks, 4 healers, 12 DPS. From there, we can start to personalize the composition a bit. Personally, I insist on having at least 2 supports per party, whether it's 2 locusts or a locust and an enigmatic, or you could even have 2 locusts, an enigmatic, and an icicle. But 4 tanks and 4 healers is really kind of the minimum. So these support slots would take up DPS slots and leave you with 8 or 10, depending on how many you have. I also tend to prefer being a little more tank heavy and would rather have about 6 tanks, one of which could be swapped out for like an icicle or something. So a Railhouse party composition then would look like about 5 tanks, 4 healers, 3 supports, and 80 APS. So tanks, we'd have like 1 to 2 camlands, 2 to 3 groves, 0 to 1 soul size. Maybe swap out a grove for a grail seeker nowadays. For healers, we'd probably have like 3 fallen, 1 wild staff. Supports would be 1 to 2 locusts, 0 to 1 enigmatics, 0 to 1 icicles. And then 8 DPS. I'm not terribly picky. I guess I have a tendency towards range DPS, but if you're doing purely open world, then having a bunch of melee is perfectly fine. There are some special case weapons, so dots and static effects don't stack. You kind of have to figure that out on a weapon by weapon basis, because for instance, a siege bow doesn't debuff the target; it just does damage in an area, and so you can have a bunch of them stacked. I think what's a good example? I think Damnation is a dot, and so if you hit more than hit people with more than one, it just like overwrites the other one, or I'm not sure if it takes whichever one's more damage, but probably just overwrites it. Spirit Hunter's the same way. Well, you can only hit people with 1 Spirit Hunter at a time. I believe they made it so that Spectre Jacket doesn't stack. Yeah, so that's just something they have to think about on a weapon by weapon basis. Generally, if it puts a debuff on the target to do its damage, then it doesn't stack. If you remember my little blurb during the ZvZ mechanics video, I mentioned that to get around focus fire protection, you would want fewer people hitting large groups. And I don't know if they do this anymore, but when we fought Homeless Crew a couple months ago, I think they really did this the best out of anyone. Maybe I can link the battle board, but in one of our fights, out of roughly like 150-man Zerg, which is about 7 parties, they had like 40 supports. No joke. That's 5 to 6 supports per party. This inevitably means that you're going to be DPS light, but they got around that by having very high IP and by being very coordinated with their damage. With that many locusts, you can also afford to have plenty of offensive locusts. The plural form is loci, but that just sounds really dumb, so I don't know. Again, I don't know if they still do this or if it was like a specialized territory composition, but it is something to keep in mind. It can be done if you have high enough IP DPS and you're all super coordinated with your damage, making sure you're hitting the same targets so that they actually die. On the other hand, you could get around focused fire protection by just running all Bridled Furies with your like 80% resilience penetration.